you ever wish to know what marriage was like back in the 60s and how it has changed over the last 59 years? For example, my grandparents got married when they were just 18, while my parents got married at 22 and 28. Let's take a look at how marriage has changed from back then till now. My main decades that I will be focusing on are the 1960s, the 1980s, and the 2000s. First, I will talk about marriage in the 60s. Marriage is something that has been going on for years and years, and it is nothing new to society. 79% of people over 18 got married. The average groom was 23, and the average woman was 20. Marriage was still based on love, and the divorce rate was only 22% in the 60s. According to HowStuffWorks.com, women began working outside of the home more, changing the ideal marriage. And compared to the 50s, where women stayed at home with the kids and did all of the cooking and cleaning, and they relied on their husband to bring in the income. In the 60s, only 27% of women were working. Women also felt is that they didn't need to be married as young, which is really unusual to society, because they expected them to be housewives and take care of the children. According to UFL.edu, towards the end of the 1960s, arrival of birth control weakened relationships between sex and marriage. Now that you know a little bit how women were no longer being housewives and getting married later in life, let's talk about the 80s. In the 80s, we see more interracial marriages and a higher divorce rate. 80s went through a cultural revelation due to the rise in feminism and sex positivity. Women were changing their bodies and they were no longer a size 2. They changed their eating habits and their exercising habits. By the end of the 80s, the average groom was 26 years old and the average bride was 23. The divorce rate went up in the 80s due to the fact that of the wars that were going on. It hit a peaking rate of 5.3 divorces per 1,000 couple, which is more than 1.2 million divorces. According to MarriageGroup.com, families were changing by the men were spending more time with the kids and the women were spending more time working at their own jobs. 80s, we see more interracial marriages due to the fact it was frowned upon in previous generations, and it was let alone legal. Now that we've talked about the 60s and 80s, let's fast forward to the 2000s. In the 2000s, we see a lower marriage rate and a higher divorce rate. Marriage in the 2000s constantly went up and down between marriage rate and divorce rate as it was heavily fluctuated. In the 2000s, both women and men were working full-time jobs and spending time with their children. This became necessary due to the economy. 3.5% of men were now becoming stay-at-home dads, while in the 60s that was not heard of, and in the 70s, 2.3% of husbands were staying home with their children. We see in the 2000s same-sex marriage and more diversity between these marriages. Average groom was now 29 and the average bride was 27. In 2007, we see 66% of women are now working full-time jobs. Divorce is now more common in people over 50 and tripling in people that are over 65. People between the ages of 25 and 34 have never been married, and that has doubled the rates from the 60s. And the US marriage rate overall is at historic. Now I'm going to be giving you a little bit of a visual aid. In the first one, we see the age change of women in the 1960s as they were getting married younger, and then we see it grow towards the 80s and more towards the 2000s. And in this one, we see how the divorce rate has changed from the 1960s to the 1980s with it almost tripling. And then we see it decrease in the 90s and start to increase again, coming towards the 2000 to 2011. Today we discussed how marriages changed from the 60s and the 2000s. Women are changing how they look and how they felt about marriage. And in the 80s, we see more dads spending time with their kids and moms start working full time. And in the 2000s, people are getting married later and getting divorced more often. Lots has changed in 59 years. What has stayed the same is the love that is shared between the two spouses when they first get engaged and married. In conclusion, marriage is something that will always be around and continue to be shared between people who love each other greatly no matter how many years go by. Thank you.